When the doctor told Celeste Arden she had 3 to 6 months to live without a compatible bone marrow donor, she thought that was the worst thing that could happen to her. She was wrong. 3 weeks later, at a charity gala her own family had organized, supposedly to raise donor awareness, her fiancé Bennett Royce stood before 200 guests in evening wear and announced with practiced composure that the wedding was indefinitely postponed. He didn't look at her once. Around her, the room murmured and shifted, and the people who had known her since childhood suddenly found their champagne glasses very interesting. No one stepped forward. No one said her name. Celeste felt her legs give out. And the only person who moved was a man she had never met. Dorian Bellamy, a black single father who had spent the evening fixing a fuse box behind the stage, wearing a work shirt among all that silk and diamonds. He caught her. He sat with her. And 3 days later, he slid a simple silver ring onto her finger and said quietly, "Then let me marry you." Why would a stranger propose to a woman with only months to live? If that question already has your attention, you're in the right place. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Celeste Arden had grown up understanding one thing above all else. The family name was not just a name. It was a promise, a performance, and a prison, depending on the day. The Ardens of Savannah were old money wrapped in new polish. Lionel Arden had inherited a modest coastal hotel business from his father and turned it into a regional empire. 6 properties along the Georgia shoreline, a foundation that appeared on the letterhead of every major charity event in the county, and a reputation built on the careful management of appearances. His wife, Margot, was gracious and soft-spoken, the kind of woman who arranged flowers for hospital lobbies and remembered the names of every catering staff member at every event. Their youngest daughter, Celeste, had been raised to be the living embodiment of everything the Arden name promised. Poised, beautiful, educated, and utterly without complaint. She had fulfilled that role dutifully for 28 years. Then the diagnosis arrived, and the role became impossible to play. Acute myeloid leukemia. Advanced stage. The doctor at Savannah Memorial had delivered the news with the careful neutrality of someone who had done it many times before. Without aggressive treatment and ultimately a compatible bone marrow transplant, the prognosis was 3 to 6 months. With treatment, perhaps longer, but the window for finding a donor was narrow, and the likelihood of a match within her existing registry was low. Celeste had listened, nodded, shaken the doctor's hand, and walked to her car. She sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes before driving home. She did not tell her family right away. She already knew, instinctively, how each of them would respond, and she needed a few days before she had to watch those responses unfold. She was right about all of it. Lionel's first question, delivered across the dinner table with the measured tone of a man reviewing a quarterly report, was whether the diagnosis needed to be disclosed to the Foundation's board. Margot wept quietly and said she would pray. Bennett, her fiancé, said the right words, "Of course I'm here, we'll get through this together," and then began, in the weeks that followed, to find reasons to cancel plans, shorten calls, and avoid accompanying her to treatment appointments. The charity gala had been Lionel's idea. He framed it as a campaign to register potential donors, a way to use the family's platform for good. Celeste had agreed because it seemed like the only useful thing she could do with her own illness. She had not understood, until she was standing in the middle of that ballroom in a pale dress with her face carefully made up to hide how thin she had become, that the event was not really about her at all. It was about controlling the narrative before someone else did. Bennett's announcement came without warning. He did not pull her aside first. He did not lower his voice. He simply stepped near the microphone during a lull between speeches, thanked everyone for their support of the Arden family during this difficult time, and stated that given the circumstances, he and Celeste had mutually agreed to postpone the wedding indefinitely. It was a lie delivered as a courtesy. She had agreed to nothing. The applause that followed was uncertain, scattered. Then the murmuring began, the particular murmur of a crowd recalibrating, deciding what this information meant for them and their association with the people involved. Celeste stood very still. She felt the blood drain from her face, and she thought, with strange clarity, that she was being erased in real time, not by illness, by the people who were supposed to love her. Her father was already speaking quietly to a board member near the bar. Her mother stood frozen by the floral arrangement, her hands clasped, doing nothing. Bennett had stepped away from the microphone and was accepting a glass of wine from a passing server. No one looked at her. Her knees went first. Dorian Bellamy had not planned to be at the Arden Gala. He had picked up the electrical job through a contractor he occasionally worked with. A last-minute call, a fuse panel issue behind the main stage that needed a licensed hand before the event began. It paid $240, which would cover Kira's school field trip and half a week of groceries. He had driven over in his work truck, done the job quietly, and was gathering his tools in the corridor behind the ballroom when the crowd sounds changed. He heard the applause shift, heard the murmuring begin. Then, through the half-open service door, he saw a woman in a pale dress standing completely alone in the center of a full room. He recognized that kind of aloneness. He had seen it on his wife's face in the last months of her illness. That particular moment when a person realizes the people around them are already beginning to grieve in their own direction, away from the person who is actually dying. He was still holding his tool bag when she buckled. He moved before he thought about it. Through the service door, across the edge of the room, past the guests who stepped back without stepping forward, and he caught her arm before she went down. She was lighter than he expected, which told him something about how long she had been sick. He didn't say anything. He simply guided her out of the ballroom, through the corridor, and to a bench in a quiet hallway where the noise was muffled and the air was cooler. He set down his tool bag, found a glass of water on a nearby catering cart, and held it out to her. She stared at it for a moment, then took it. "You don't have to smile," he said. "There's no one watching you out here." She looked at him as though she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "I know what it's like," he said, "to be in a room full of people who are more concerned with how your situation affects them than with how it's affecting you." Celeste said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "My fiancé just called off our wedding in front of everyone." "I heard. My father is probably already talking to his PR person." "I saw." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, except there was nothing funny in it. They sat in the corridor for a while, this stranger in a work shirt and this woman in her pale gown, and neither of them pretended the other wasn't there. Dorian reached into his jacket pocket. He had carried the ring for years, his mother's, a simple silver band worn smooth at the edges, a piece he kept not to give away but because letting go of it had never felt right. He didn't fully understand, even afterward, what made him take it out in that moment. Only that she was sitting beside him like someone preparing to disappear, and something in him refused to let that go unremarked. He held the ring out. She stared at it. "I'm not doing this out of pity," he said. "I'm doing it because nobody in that room treated you like someone worth staying for. And I think you deserve to know that somebody would." He paused. "Let me marry you." Celeste did not say yes that night. She said she needed to think, which was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in months. Dorian gave her his number, picked up his tool bag, and walked back to his truck without asking for anything else. He did not call. He did not follow up. He simply left the door open and let her decide whether to walk through it. She called him 4 days later, not to accept, just to talk. They met at a coffee shop on the east side of Savannah, far from the neighborhoods where anyone who knew the Arden name was likely to walk in. Dorian arrived 5 minutes early with 2 coffees already on the table. Celeste arrived in a plain coat with her hair down, looking for the first time in weeks like a person rather than a patient. They talked for 2 hours. She learned that he had a daughter named Kira, 8 years old, who drew animals on every surface she was allowed to draw on, and a few she wasn't. That he had been a licensed electrician for 9 years and drove for a car service 3 nights a week to cover the gap between what the work paid and what a child cost. That his wife, Dara, had died of an autoimmune condition 3 years earlier after a 14-month illness that had taught him, among other things, exactly what it looked like when the medical system and the people around a sick person stopped treating her like she had a future. She used to say the hardest part wasn't the pain, he said. It was the way people started talking about her in the past tense while she was still in the room. Celeste wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. That's exactly what it feels like. I know. She looked at him across the table. This man she had met 4 days ago in a hallway, who had offered her the most radical act of kindness she had ever been shown, and who was now sitting across from her talking about grief like it was something he had learned to carry rather than something that had broken him. She did not understand him yet, but she trusted in some wordless way that he was telling the truth. She told him yes on the way out. Standing on the sidewalk, coat pulled tight against the October wind, she said it simply. All right. Yes. Dorian nodded. He didn't make a show of it. He just said, okay. And they stood there for a moment in the ordinary afternoon light, two people who had just agreed to something neither of them could fully explain. The decision ignited the Arden household like a match dropped in dry grass. Lionel's reaction was swift and surgical. He called Celeste into his study the morning after she told her mother, sat behind his desk with the stillness of a man who had already decided the outcome of the conversation, and told her plainly that Dorian Bellamy was a laborer with a minor record, a dismissed misdemeanor from 12 years ago that Lionel had apparently had someone look up within hours, and that this relationship would not be recognized by the family, would not be announced publicly, and would under no circumstances move forward while she was still receiving financial support from the Arden estate. If you do this, he said, you do it without us. Celeste looked at her father across the wide mahogany desk. She thought about all the years she had arranged herself to fit his requirements, the right school, the right friends, the right fiancé, the right smile at the right events, and how none of it had stopped her from getting sick, and none of it had made him treat her like a daughter rather than an asset. Then I'd do it without you, she said. She moved into a small, furnished apartment near the medical center within the week, using money from a personal account her mother had quietly set up for her years earlier and never mentioned to Lionel. Margot did not say much, but she helped Celeste pack. Bennett's response came through the media before it came through him directly. Within days of the news spreading through Savannah's social circles, a story appeared in a local gossip column suggesting that Celeste Arden had taken up with an opportunistic laborer who saw a dying heiress as a path to financial security. The language was careful enough to avoid a defamation claim. The implication was clear enough to do damage. Dorian lost 2 contracts in the same week. Clients who had worked with him for years called to say they were going in a different direction. He listened, noted it, and called his next job. Kira came home from school one afternoon quieter than usual. At dinner, she told him some kids had said her dad was marrying a rich lady to get her money. Dorian set down his fork. He looked at his daughter for a long moment, at her careful face, the way she was watching him to see how he would handle it. Some things you do because they're right, he said, not because everybody's going to understand them. You understand? Kira considered this. Did you do the right thing? Yeah, he said. I did. She went back to her food. That was enough for her, which made it easier for him to let it be enough for himself. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were, in ways Celeste had not anticipated, good. Dorian did not try to fix her illness or fill her days with grand gestures. He simply showed up, consistently, quietly, in the particular way of a person who understood that presence was its own form of love. After her Tuesday infusion sessions, he would be waiting in the hospital parking lot with a container of soup he had made the night before, something warm and simple, and they would sit in the cab of his truck and eat together before he drove her home. On the mornings she felt strong enough, he took her to the river at dawn, and they would sit on the bank and watch the light come up over the water without needing to talk about what came next. He brought her a notebook, plain green cover, nothing special, and told her to write down the things she wanted to do. Not a bucket list, he said. Not a countdown. Just a record of wanting. Because wanting things was proof of being alive. She wrote slowly at first, then more. A concert she had always meant to attend. A drive up the coast with the windows down. Learning to make her mother's biscuit recipe from scratch. Watching Kira draw. That last one happened by accident. Dorian brought his daughter along one Saturday afternoon when his usual sitter canceled, and Kira arrived with a canvas tote bag containing 6 markers, a sketch pad, and a level of self-possession unusual in an 8-year-old. She sat at the kitchen table, studied Celeste for approximately 45 seconds, and then began drawing her, not as she was, pale and careful and braced for the next hard thing, but as someone bright-eyed and slightly windswept, standing on what appeared to be the deck of a large ship. "Is that me?" Celeste asked. "It's you if you were an explorer," Kira said, without looking up. Celeste looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she asked if she could keep it. Kira shrugged. "I made it for you." After that, Kira started leaving small drawings on Celeste's kitchen counter whenever she visited. Animals mostly, but sometimes people, sometimes landscapes from places Kira had seen in books and wanted to go. They became, without anyone declaring it, a kind of ongoing correspondence between an 8-year-old and a woman trying to remember what it felt like to look forward to something. The bone marrow donor search had widened to 3 national registries with no confirmed match. Celeste's oncologist, Dr. Harmon, was measured in her updates. Professionally optimistic, carefully honest. The disease was progressing. The window for a successful transplant was not indefinite. Every week without a donor narrowed the margin. It was Margot who broke open the larger secret, though she did not intend to do it the way it happened. She arrived at Celeste's apartment on a Wednesday evening carrying a casserole dish and the look of a woman who had been rehearsing something for a long time. They ate together without speaking much. Then Margot set down her fork, looked at the table, and said she needed to tell Celeste something about the foundation. 12 years earlier, Margot had quietly funded a community bone marrow registry program, a small, unglamorous initiative that partnered with neighborhood clinics in lower-income areas of Savannah to register donors who would otherwise never enter the national database. She had done it with her own money she had inherited from her mother because she had read about the donor gap for patients from mixed or underrepresented backgrounds and had wanted to do something real, not just something visible. The program had registered hundreds of donors over 4 years. It had facilitated several successful transplants for patients who had no other options. Then Lionel had absorbed it into the Arden Foundation. Margot had believed at first that this was simply an administrative consolidation, that the work would continue under a larger umbrella. It was only gradually, over years of avoidance and redirected questions, that she had come to understand something was wrong. Donor records had been archived in a way that made them functionally inaccessible. The program's original staff had been replaced. Requests from medical centers to access the registry had been quietly declined. She had never confronted Lionel directly. She had told herself she wasn't sure, that she might be misunderstanding, that she had no proof. "But I think someone in there was a match for you," she said. She could not look at Celeste while she said it. "I think there may have been a match in that registry for years, and I think your father knew." The room was very quiet. Celeste sat across from her mother and felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow. Something older and more structural, like a wall she had been leaning against her whole life, slowly revealing itself to be hollow. "Why?" she finally said. Margot pressed her hands flat on the table. "There are financial records I was never supposed to see. From 8 years ago, the foundation had significant losses from bad investments your father made without board approval. Money was moved to cover it, money that had been designated for the registry program." She paused. "If you were treated successfully using a donor from that program, you might have started asking questions about the foundation, and those questions would have led somewhere he couldn't afford for them to go." Celeste stared at her mother, at the woman who had been gentle her entire life, who had arranged flowers for hospital lobbies and cried quietly and said she would pray, and who had spent years knowing something was wrong and choosing again and again to stay silent. "I'm sorry," Margot said. It came out barely above a whisper. Celeste stood up from the table. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below. The ordinary Savannah evening, the live oaks, the amber streetlights just coming on. She had come very close to dying without ever knowing that her own father had looked at her illness and calculated what her survival might cost him. She thought about Dorian sitting in the hospital parking lot with soup he had made himself. She thought about Kira drawing her as an explorer on the deck of a ship. She thought about a ring worn smooth at the edges, held out by a stranger in a corridor, offered without condition. She turned back to her mother. "Do you still have access to anything? Records, correspondence, anything from the original program?" Margot looked up. Something in her face changed. The particular look of a person who has been waiting, without admitting it even to themselves, for someone to finally ask. "Yes," she said. "I kept copies. I kept everything." Dorian did not hesitate when Celeste told him what her mother had revealed. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me what you need." That was the thing about him she had come to understand. He did not make her suffering about himself. He did not perform outrage or offer solutions before she had finished speaking. He simply asked what she needed and waited for the answer. What she needed, she told him, was to find the people from the original registry program. The staff who had worked it before Lionel absorbed it into the Foundation. The clinic coordinators who had collected the donor samples. Someone who could confirm the records existed and point toward where they had been buried. Dorian knew how to find people. Not through lawyers or private investigators, but through the particular network of working Savannah. The contractors and clinic volunteers and church hall coordinators who knew the east side of the city the way the Arden family never had. He made calls. He drove to 2 community health centers that had partnered with the original program. He sat across from a retired nurse named Gloria, who remembered Margot Arden coming in person to set up the intake tables, remembered the quiet pride of it, and who had kept her own records out of professional habit long after the program went silent. Gloria remembered a name, Rosalie Mercer, a woman who had registered as a donor through the community program 7 years ago, a nurse herself working at a pediatric clinic on the west side. She had registered, Gloria said, because a woman named Dara had sat with her during a particularly bad week and told her that small acts of showing up for strangers were what held the world together. Dorian went very still when he heard his wife's name. He found Rosalie Mercer the following afternoon. She was 41, practical, direct, and not particularly surprised to hear that a donor registry had been mismanaged by a wealthy foundation. When Dorian explained Celeste's situation, Rosalie agreed immediately to be re-evaluated. She said Dara had been the kind of person whose kindness you felt obligated to pass forward. She said she had wondered over the years whether her registration had ever meant anything to anyone. It had meant everything. She simply hadn't known it yet. Lionel moved before they could get the information to the medical center. Dorian had accessed the archived donor records through a login provided by Gloria, an old administrative credential from her time with the program that the Foundation's IT team had failed to deactivate after she retired. He had used it in good faith, trying to pull the documentation that would allow Rosalie's file to be formally reinstated, but the access was traceable and Lionel had people watching. 2 days later, Dorian was arrested. The charge was unauthorized access to protected medical records, a civil matter dressed up in criminal language, filed through a complaint submitted by the Arden Foundation's legal team. The story that appeared in the media by that evening was swift and coordinated. A man had infiltrated a charitable foundation's private database, likely in an attempt to extract leverage against the Arden family. The word extortion appeared in one headline. It was not retracted. Dorian was held overnight, released on bail the following morning. He lost 2 more clients before noon. Kira stayed with a neighbor for a few days, and Dorian accepted the arrangement because he did not want his daughter to see the inside of what he was now standing in. He was not angry. He was, in the way of a person who has already survived the worst thing, simply very tired. Celeste saw the news on her phone from her hospital bed. She had been admitted 2 days earlier after a fever that her immune system could not manage on its own. The infection was controlled, but her body's reserves were diminishing faster than her doctors had hoped. Dr. Harmon had spoken to her that morning in the careful language of someone narrowing timelines. When Celeste saw Dorian's name in the headline, something in her chest went cold. She had known Lionel was capable of self-preservation. She had grown up watching him make calculations. But this, using the legal system as a weapon against a man whose only crime was trying to help her live, was something she had not let herself fully anticipate. Bennett appeared at the hospital that afternoon. He arrived with flowers she hadn't asked for and the smooth, practiced manner of a man who had rehearsed the conversation in advance. He sat down and told her, gently, as though offering her something, that her father was prepared to resolve everything quietly. Dorian's charges would be dropped. The media would be redirected. Celeste would receive full access to the Foundation's medical resources. All she needed to do was end things with Dorian, say publicly that the relationship had been a mistake made during a vulnerable period, and sign a limited power of attorney allowing Lionel to oversee her medical decisions during recovery. "It's the practical choice," Bennett said. "You know it is." Celeste looked at the flowers on her bedside table. She thought about the word practical. She had been practical her entire life. Practical had cost her years she could not get back. "Get out," she said. Bennett left the flowers and went. His exit from the situation was as clean and final as everything else about him. A man who had never fully arrived, now fully gone. Dorian came that evening during visiting hours, still carrying the weight of the past 2 days in the set of his shoulders. He sat in the chair beside her bed and they were quiet together for a while. Then Celeste reached for his hand and placed the silver ring in his palm. "I need you to take this back," she said. He looked at her. "You have Kira to think about. You've already lost work. You're facing charges that could follow you for years, and it's going to get worse before it gets better." Her voice was even, but her eyes were not. "I won't let what's left of my life be the thing that destroys yours. Celeste." "I mean it." She closed his fingers around the ring. "You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. You gave me weeks where I felt like a person instead of a problem. That's real. That mattered." She exhaled. "But I love you enough to let you go." Dorian sat with the ring in his closed hand for a long time. His jaw was tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and very steady. "You think leaving is how you protect people," he said. "But I've sat beside someone I loved while she was dying, and I promise you, the thing that hurt her most was not the illness. It was the people who decided, on her behalf, that she'd be better off without them." Celeste turned her face toward the window. "Take Kira somewhere safe," she said. "Please." Dorian stood. He looked at her for a moment, at the woman who had just ended something real in order to protect him from it, and he did not argue further. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "I'm not leaving Savannah," he said. Then he walked out. Kira asked her father one question the night he brought her home from the neighbor's house. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the remains of a reheated dinner between them, and Kira had been quiet in the careful way she got when she was thinking something through. Then she looked up and said, "If Celeste dies because nobody told the truth, are you going to be able to forgive yourself?" Dorian set down his fork. He had spent the drive home telling himself he had done what he could, that he had been arrested, publicly humiliated, stripped of work, and that Celeste herself had asked him to step back. He had a daughter to raise. He had a life that existed before Celeste and would have to continue after her. There were limits to what one person could absorb. All of that was true, and none of it answered his daughter's question. He looked at Kira, at her 8-year-old face, entirely serious, waiting, and he understood that she was not asking whether he had done enough. She was asking whether he could live with having stopped. He knew the answer. He had known it since he walked out of Celeste's hospital room with a silver ring in his fist. "No," he said. "I couldn't." Kira nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already known. She picked up her fork and went back to eating. The matter, in her view, was settled. Dorian called Margot Arden at 7 the following morning. He told her what he needed: the documents she had described to Celeste, the financial records, the correspondence, the donor lists from the original program. He told her he was not going to use them as leverage or take them to the media without her involvement. He needed them for an independent attorney who could compel the Foundation to reinstate Rosalie Mercer's donor file through proper legal channels and simultaneously address the fabricated charges against him. Margot was silent for a long moment. "If I do this," she said, "there's no going back." "I know." Another silence, then, "I'll have everything ready by this afternoon." The attorney was a woman named Patricia Oakes, recommended by Gloria, a detail that felt to Dorian like the kind of thing that happened when the right pieces of a situation finally started moving together. Patricia was 60, unhurried, and had spent 30 years doing civil rights and healthcare equity work in Georgia. She reviewed Margot's documents in a single evening and called Dorian the next morning with the particular calm of someone who has just confirmed what they suspected. The financial irregularities were substantive. The interference with donor records was documentable. The criminal complaint against Dorian had been filed using procedural mechanisms designed for institutional protection, not genuine criminal conduct. In her professional opinion, it would not survive a serious challenge. She filed the challenge that week. Lionel fought it the way powerful men fight things they expected to win easily. With pressure, with delay, with intermediaries sent to offer settlements that required silence as a condition. The settlements were declined. The pressure ran into the particular resistance of documented evidence, and a lawyer who had been doing this work longer than Lionel had been building his reputation. Margot gave a formal statement to Patricia's office and, subsequently, to the Foundation's Independent Board Oversight Committee. She did not waver. The woman who had arranged flowers and said she would pray had apparently been carrying a spine underneath all that gentleness for years, waiting for the moment it was required. The donor file for Rosalie Mercer was formally reinstated within 10 days of the legal filing. Rosalie underwent updated compatibility testing. The results confirmed what Gloria's archived records had suggested. She was a strong match for Celeste. Dorian's charges were dropped the same week, quietly, with no public statement from the Foundation's legal team. There was no apology. He had not expected one. Celeste was told about Rosalie on a Thursday afternoon. Dr. Harmon delivered the news with the controlled optimism of a doctor who has learned not to promise outcomes, but cannot entirely conceal relief. A confirmed adult donor. Strong compatibility. The transplant could be scheduled within the month, pending Celeste's current condition stabilizing enough for the procedure. Celeste listened to all of it. Then she asked to be alone for a few minutes. She sat in the hospital room in the particular quiet of someone absorbing something too large to process quickly. She thought about the years the match had sat in an archived database while her father protected his balance sheet. She thought about her mother's voice saying, "I kept everything." She thought about Rosalie Mercer, a woman she had never met, who had walked into a community clinic 7 years ago because a woman named Dara had once sat with her during a bad week. She thought about Dorian. She picked up her phone. He answered before the second ring. "I know," he said. "Patricia called me this morning." "I took the ring off," she said. "I put it in your hand and told you to leave." "You did." "I was wrong." A silence. Not an uncomfortable one. The kind between two people who have already said the harder things and are simply finding their way back to level ground. "Kira wants to know if you're still going to teach her to make your mother's biscuits," he said. Celeste laughed. It surprised her. The realness of it, the way it moved through her chest without obstruction. "Tell her yes," she said. The transplant was scheduled for a morning in late November. Rosalie Mercer arrived at the hospital the evening before, practical and calm, carrying a paperback novel and a thermos of coffee. She and Celeste met for the first time in the hallway outside the pre-procedure wing. Two women standing in the ordinary fluorescent light of a hospital corridor, connected by a thread that ran back through years and losses neither of them had chosen. "Thank you," Celeste said. It felt insufficient. She said it anyway. "Dara would have done it herself if she could have," Rosalie said simply. "This is just the next best thing." Dorian, standing a few feet away, looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up, and his face was the face of a man who has learned to hold grief and gratitude in the same hand without dropping either one. Dorian sat outside the surgical suite for 4 hours and 11 minutes. He held the silver ring the entire time. He did not pray exactly. He was not by nature a man who prayed. But he spoke quietly to Dara in the way he sometimes did when he needed to think out loud to someone who had known him completely. He told her about Celeste, about the gala hallway, the green notebook, the river at dawn, about Kira's drawings and the biscuit recipe, and a woman who had spent her whole life being performed and had finally, in the worst months of it, begun to simply be. He told her he thought she would have liked Celeste very much. He thought she would have agreed. When Dr. Harmon came through the doors, her expression was the careful neutral of someone managing their own relief. She told him the procedure had gone as well as they could have hoped. The early indicators were positive. There would be a long recovery, months of monitoring, no guarantees. But Celeste had come through the surgery, and that was the first gate, and they had passed it. Dorian sat with that for a moment. Then he went to find Kira, who had spent the afternoon in the waiting room drawing a picture of a woman standing in a garden, looking up at something just beyond the edge of the page. When Celeste opened her eyes, the first thing she saw were the ceiling tiles, the soft beep of a monitor, and Dorian's face, tired and present and entirely, unmistakably, there. On the bedside table next to a small drawing of a woman in a garden sat the silver ring. She reached for it herself this time. She slid it onto her finger without being asked. "I choose to live," she said. Her voice was rough from the anesthesia, barely above a whisper. Dorian leaned forward and took her hand. "I know," he said. "I've known that about you for a while." Recovery was not cinematic. It was slow and unglamorous and punctuated by setbacks. A fever in the 3rd week, a stretch of crushing fatigue in the 6th, a morning in December when Celeste sat on the edge of her hospital bed and could not find the energy to believe the hard part was behind her. On that morning, Dorian sat beside her without speaking, and Kira climbed onto the bed uninvited and leaned against Celeste's shoulder and began narrating, in great detail, the plot of a book she was reading about a girl who sailed across an ocean alone. Celeste listened. After a while, she started asking questions. That was the morning she understood that healing was not a single threshold you crossed, but a collection of small returns. To curiosity, to appetite, to the particular pleasure of caring what happened next in someone else's story. She returned to those things slowly, and then all at once. By February, she was well enough to leave the hospital. She did not go back to the Arden estate. She moved into a larger apartment near the medical center, close enough to her follow-up appointments, far enough from the world she had been raised in to breathe differently. Margot helped her carry boxes, and this time neither of them pretended it was temporary. Lionel faced a formal investigation from the State Attorney General's office into the Foundation's financial irregularities. The board voted to place him on indefinite administrative leave pending the outcome. The empire he had spent his life constructing was not destroyed. These things rarely collapsed as cleanly as they deserved to. But it was damaged in ways that would take years to assess, and the damage was public, which was the thing he had spent decades arranging to prevent. It was not justice, exactly. Celeste had stopped waiting for exact justice sometime in November. What she had instead was the knowledge that the truth had been said aloud by people who had not been silenced, and that it had mattered. That was enough to move forward with. Margot rebuilt the Community Donor Registry program. She did it without the Arden Foundation's name attached to it, using the remainder of her personal inheritance and a small grant Patricia helped her locate through a healthcare equity nonprofit. She hired Gloria as a volunteer coordinator. She partnered with the same community clinics the original program had worked with, and several new ones. She showed up in person to intake events the way she had 12 years ago, before the thing she had built had been turned into something else. She was not trying to atone. She was, as she told Celeste over the phone one evening, simply trying to finish what she had started. Celeste thought that was one of the more honest things her mother had ever said. The wedding was held on a Saturday in April in the small garden behind Savannah Memorial Hospital. Celeste had chosen the location deliberately. It was not a grand gesture or a symbolic statement. It was simply the place where she had first understood that she wanted to live, not just survive, and it seemed right to begin the next part of her life in the same geography where that understanding had arrived. The guest list was small. Patricia Oakes came, Gloria came, and brought 2 of the clinic coordinators from the new registry program. Several patients Celeste had met during her months of treatment came, people who had become, in the way of shared waiting rooms and shared uncertainty, something close to friends. Rosalie Mercer came in a green dress and stayed for the entire reception, which was just lunch at long tables in the garden, catered by a restaurant Dorian had been doing electrical work for when all of this began. There was no press. Margot took pictures on her phone, which was better anyway. Kira was the flower girl. She had strong opinions about the flowers. Standing in that garden, in a simple dress she had chosen because she liked it, rather than because it photographed well, Celeste looked at the man across from her and thought about everything that had led to this specific point in time. The diagnosis, the gala, the hallway, the ring, the notebook, the river at dawn, the surgery, the slow return of mornings that felt worth having. She thought about all the ways she had almost not been here. Dorian took her hands. His were warm and steady, the hands of a man who had fixed things his whole life and had learned, somewhere along the way, that people were not so different from the systems he worked on. They needed someone willing to show up, assess the actual damage, and stay until the lights came back on. She had spent 28 years learning to be what her family required. She had spent the last year learning to be what she actually was. They were not the same thing. The difference, it turned out, was everything. The 3 of them walked out of the garden together in the April light. Dorian, Celeste, and Kira, who had already begun planning at considerable length the menu for the dinner they were having that evening. It was not a perfect life. It was not a life without difficulty or grief or the ordinary weight of days that asked more than you had to give. But it was theirs, built not from bloodline or bank account or borrowed reputation, but from the decision, made once in a hallway and remade every day since, to stay. We spend so much of our lives waiting to be chosen, by people who see our value, who stay when things get hard, who don't flinch at the weight of who we really are. But this story wasn't about waiting. It was about a man who walked into a room full of people doing nothing and moved. It was about a woman who had been handed every reason to stop believing and didn't. Real love doesn't arrive when everything is perfect. It arrives in a hospital corridor, in a work shirt, holding a worn silver ring. It arrives when someone looks at your worst chapter and says, "I'm not leaving." That kind of love doesn't just heal the person who receives it. It reminds the rest of us what we're capable of, how much we can hold, how far we can stay, how quietly and completely one human being can change the life of another simply by refusing to walk away. If that moved something in you, subscribe, because that's exactly the kind of story we tell here, every single time.